It's love and the outcome, the God I know. You're on Vision Christian Radio. Neil Johnson with you. It is the Friday edition of 2020, and a conversation shortly I'll invite you to join into as we take I think we can call this today a deep dive into the meaning of mercy. What is mercy, and what do we glean from the Bible about mercy? As Christians, we might identify that the whole world desperately needs mercy right now. So it might be refreshing to understand that mercy was central to the life, to the ministry, and to the message of Jesus. So we're going to be asking how biblical mercy is so radically disruptive and transformative. Our special guests today, Matthew C. Clarke and Annabella Rossini-Clarke, have written a book called Disrupting Mercy, the Gift of Extreme Kindness, Motivated by Compassion. Matthew is principal researcher with the Freedom Keys Research Project, focusing on prevention of human trafficking. And Annabella Rossini-Clarke is founder of Turning Teardrops into Joy. And let me just say, right at the outset, Disrupting Mercy is shortlisted for this year's Australian Christian Book of the Year Awards. It'll be announced on the 31st of August, the winner, in Melbourne. And so to you, especially Bella, welcome to you.
Oh, thank you.
And Matthew, welcome to you too.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Thanks for having us on. Pleased to be here, and blessings on all of your listeners as well today.
And just my congratulations on the shortlisting. If you win, that'll be wonderful. If you don't win, you've still had this wonderful accolade. Just being shortlisted for the Australian Christian Book of the Year, I think in itself is a really wonderful thing. So congratulations to the both of you on your book. Let me come to the title. Just start with the title. Disrupting Mercy. Matthew, if I come to you first, the title of the book, Disrupting Mercy, give us your insight here into what all this means.
Yes, as you can guess, we toyed with a variety of names for the book titles, and we canvassed our friends and tried various things. And the idea of disrupting mercy is a little bit ambiguous, isn't it? Is it that mercy is a disrupting thing? Or is that the book is trying to disrupt mercy? And that ambiguity was deliberate. We want to do a bit of both. We want to say that common understandings of mercy, which we'll get to in a while, I'm sure, are too weak and need to be disrupted to make space for a more radical form of mercy that we think is more biblical and shown in the life of Jesus, which itself is significantly transformative and disrupting.
We're going to be talking about mercy, but it's interesting for listeners that there's a context here. And Matthew and Annabella are personally involved with both the victims and perpetrators of human trafficking, and painfully aware of the complexities and contradictions involved in practicing disrupting mercy in the pursuit of justice. And so this is where I guess we're going to be in the deep end when we talk about mercy today. But let me just ask you, Bella, around the organisation that you are both working in and the people that you're working with, both victims and perpetrators of human trafficking, give us your insight here into what you do in ministry.
Oh, well, I guess for us, we see everything we do actually in our life as part of our ministry. So we've walked through building small backstreet communities, raising a small business that could fund our research project. And we feel that that's just as important as the work in that other human trafficking space. So we've spent a lot of time building a bedrock of community where we can discuss and challenge each other about what is missing in that space that we could dive into and do our research in. So for us, Turning Teardrops into Joy, which is a small sustainable social enterprise, it has it's sort of like an umbrella, I guess, that has a few different projects under it. But to begin with, it is a little coffee cup business that sells coffee and has conversations. So for me, that's where my presence and my energy has been. And the interesting thing, we play around with the edges of mercy in that environment. It is really interesting as you mix with people. A lot of people on a daily basis, they would come into our small community backstreet garden where there's a coffee cart, and we would talk about life, relationships. And it's interesting how I see the importance of feeding the idea of mercy in your everyday life. It's the drops of mercy that have been really strategic and important, because we're going to then dive into that network of mercy to be able to then bring out this much deeper need of mercy in a much more difficult space. So that's where I sit in this, the beginnings of this idea of mercy.
Let's get into some of the deeper water here, and you've done some significant research around this word, Matthew, challenging some of the simplistic ideas that we have about what mercy is. So, Matthew, give us your insight here. If we're looking for, some sort of a definition to hold on to, and there might be some simple definitions, and then there might be some different layers. And I know this is your area, so give us your insight here. Yeah. Challenge our simplistic ideas.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of us are driven by by two key pictures. One is the picture that Bill talked about of someone beaten on the battlefield with the victor's foot on his throat, and the person lying down there cries out for mercy. They've been beaten, they're about to die, and they ask, "Please don't kill me, just have mercy on me." And the other image, I think, that drives a lot of our understanding of mercy is the courtroom, where someone has been found guilty of some crime, and as a last-minute effort, they throw themselves on the mercy of the court, and in effect saying, "Look, to the judge, you are right in convicting me, but please don't give me the punishment that I perhaps deserve." Now, those two images, I think, are common and drive how we in our Western English world think about mercy, but I'm not sure that they're the strongest images that come across in the Bible. And I'm not sure that those two images have much value in really horrendous contexts like human trafficking. What does mercy mean to a victim of human trafficking? And in a more complex question, what does mercy look like to a perpetrator of human trafficking? So I want to try to get past those common stereotypes, if you like. I tend to think the simple definition of mercy is that mercy is compassion in action.
And let's just dwell here for a moment, and there's plenty more to say there, I know, with various layers, but in some sense, when we think of the human trafficking situation, where you've got those who are victims of human trafficking and those who are the perpetrators of human trafficking, the natural human inclination is to say, I'm on the side of the goodies who are the victims, and we want to be compassionate and merciful, and we want to be helpful to them. But those ones on the other side, we're thinking they're the baddies. How do I be merciful and compassionate to the baddies as well? I'm not sure which one of you wants to respond here, but if I come to Bella, what are your thoughts here? And we'll come back to Matthew. But what we're talking about here is mercifulness to the baddies, and as a Christian foundation concept that might shake the way we think about mercy.
Yeah. For sure. And you will note as you listen to Matt and I, Matt gives you the more scholarly, intellectual, answer, and I'll give you the flowery experiential one. But mine still is steeped in some strong theological understanding as well. Look, I think the first thing that happened many, many years ago, I was I think Matt and I were both actually at a small conference with a rescue organisation. And I remember sitting there, and it was amazing to see the stories of how some of these girls had been rescued. And And then towards the end, there was this cheer and clap because finally, we got one of the baddies in jail, and everyone literally stood up and clapped. And I found myself, I couldn't stand up. There was part of me that thought, I know my own shadow side. I know that there are often stories behind people's actions that we don't understand. And it was a response to that, I think, really shook me and thought, yes, the girls need rescuing, but maybe the person, and you'll notice I say person who perpetrates, I try to give a face to a monster, I try to demonsterize, that person will have a story. I'm sure when that person was born and was a small child, they didn't decide, I am going to go and destroy someone's life. Things have happened in their life that builds a vulnerability, perhaps, and we'll talk about that in a little while, to become someone who goes down that road of very poor decisions, those decisions that destroy others, but actually destroys themselves, because we're not built to destroy others. So there is a consequence of that. So in that moment, I saw the person who was the perpetrator, the person who we finally got that one in jail. My goodness, they are a victim as well. What are we doing about rescuing the one? And that was the beginnings of me going down this road, going, if we want to rescue those other people in the future, if we change the life of that one person who has made poor decision, has become a perpetrator, we not only rescue the future victims of that person who's a perpetrator, but we actually rescue that one. And I kept seeing that image of the parable of the Good Shepherd going out and finding the lost, going towards the lost, and not necessarily reprimanding, you silly sheep, you made wrong decisions and went off, actually carried that sheep home and helped integrate that sheep back into the fold. So that's probably the mandate that I carry in my heart that has helped me walk in that space. And we only walk in a theoretical space at this stage because we are trying to come up with what else could we be doing in this space that could help end modern slavery. Hope that's answered your question.
It does, and coming back to Matthew for that scholarly side here, because the thought that we might find ourselves on the side of a baddie, but maybe it's not the baddie taking sides, it might be on the sides of the victims and the perpetrator. But for most of us who think that the perpetrator does not deserve mercy, does not deserve my attention, this is, is there some historic precedence here? Jesus in his ministry. How do we reflect on mercifulness to the baddie?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a bunch of stories in the Bible, including the life of Jesus. The one that inspired us, and it features in the early part of the book, is about Zacchaeus. So Jesus was walking through Jericho, and there was an outcast Jew within that town who was a tax collector. And he was outcast because he was a tax collector. He was betraying his people by collecting taxes on behalf of the Romans. And Jesus walks into that town. Zacchaeus climbs a tree because he's apparently a short guy. Then the crowd's too dense for him to get a line of sight on Jesus. But Jesus notices him, and in contrast to the crowd that was shunning that man in their community context, Jesus called Zacchaeus down from the tree and said, I want to go and have a meal with you. So Jesus moves towards the exploiter, to the perpetrator. And Zacchaeus had some radical transformation. We don't know the actual content of their talk together, but it radically changed Zacchaeus. And I think it's a prime example of the transformative effect of mercy. Jesus sided with the perpetrator and said, you also are a son of Abraham. And Zacchaeus receives that as an act of mercy that was completely unexpected, and changes his life, gives his money away to the poor and pays back people who he's wronged. And as Bella said, by rescuing the perpetrator, Jesus has also rescued all his future victims.
It's outstanding.
And so if you
we are in the deep end, and there might be listeners who'd like to contribute to our conversation today, and maybe you've never thought of the mercy of God being used through his hands and feet as having mercy to the baddies as well as the goodies. It just reminds me just how significant it is, because there's an awful lot of Christian testimonies that you'll hear of people who were pretty bad people, and they have been recipients of the mercy of God that must have come in some sense by someone who relayed to them a message of mercy, and that is in itself a hand reached out in merciful love to the baddie. So we're talking through these things, and I want to just invite listeners to join in our conversation today. So opening our talkback line on 1-800-316-316, our two very special guests, Matthew C. Clarke and Annabella Rossini-Clarke. They've written a book called Disrupting Mercy, the gift of extreme kindness motivated by compassion. 1-800-316-316. We'll be talking some more in just a few moments. Well, I said we'd be in the deep end, and some complexities around our conversation today, and would love to have you make a contribution. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. How do you feel when you hear our guests reflecting the way they do about the mercy of God? And we're talking about an extreme kindness here, one that's particularly perhaps our human nature doesn't lean us toward when we've got some compassion for victims. But what about mercy and compassion for the perpetrator as well? And is this something you reflect on as being important in the life of the church and of being a Christian today? 1-800-316-316. Our two special guests, Matthew C. Clarke and Annabella Rossini-Clarke, who we're calling Bella today. Hey, let me just, before we move on too far from here, the image that came to mind as you're sharing about the care that you have for the perpetrator, these sorts of things do come to light, but we don't always refer to them when we're talking about things like prison ministry. And you've got chaplains that will go into a prison. And, you know, the ones that are in there, let's just be, broad brushstroke and say, yes, there's baddies in prison because they've committed crimes and they've been committed to a sentence. Chaplaincy is a little bit like this too, and so it's not necessarily unusual to know that Christian leaders and Christian ministers actually do express some mercy to baddies. Matthew, what are your thoughts here as you just sort of deepen that definition?
Yeah, look, for sure. Jesus, at the early part of his ministry, said that part of what he came to do was to release the prisoners. Now, what did he mean by that? But it does call us to be engaged with prisoners in a way that releases them from whatever it is, whatever shackles are putting them in bondage. Jesus said that he came to save the sinners, not the righteous. So Jesus' ministry was toward the bad guys, which actually includes all of us. And then, of course, the other thing that you pick up from the life and the teaching of Jesus is that the greatest love is shown to your enemies. And it's not an act of mercy to be kind to someone who's nice back to you, but precisely to show some surprising kindness to people who nobody would expect because they don't seem to deserve it. That's where mercy lies. You know,
there'll be lots of Old Testament illustrations of the battles that the children of Israel fought in taking the Promised Land that might show there were the people of God who killed their enemies. Does something change with Jesus in the mix? You know, with the incarnated Son of God who appears? What changes in here? I'll stay with you on Matthew on this thought.
Yeah. Look, I think there are Old Testament passages that point towards mercy as well. So it's not a complete shift from one to the other, but there is something new that Jesus brings into the picture, and that is a more specific revelation of the character of God. So Jesus says to us that we should be merciful as God is merciful. And so the reason why we should turn our cheek when someone hits us is that that's what God does. And Jesus' life is a demonstration of that. People tried to assert violence against Jesus, and Jesus soaked up that violence, allowed it, and then dispelled the power of it through his death and resurrection. And so the event of the incarnation shows us something fundamental about the character of God, that God does not strike back at those who strike at God, that God is merciful even to God's enemies.
We are taking calls on 1800 316 316. Let's take a call from Trish, who is in South Australia. Hey, Trish, welcome along.
Hello. I've had a strong opinion about men who commit domestic violence, and it's all, they always have pity for the woman, but I always feel sorry for the man, because I think he must be a very tormented soul. And I don't know what you feel about that, but I just think we should have some. There was, I heard on the radio, TV that they were thinking of outlawing domestic violence and decreasing it by a certain year. Well, you can't make a law and say you shall not, because it's the heart that needs to change, not the. I don't know. It worries me anyway, our attitude.
Trish, you have raised something very, very important here, and I want to come to Bella for a response here. Trish's comments. Bella, what are your thoughts?
Oh, Trish, I love your heart. My heart stands very close to yours there. I would probably have exactly the same reaction. And please note that I think domestic violence needs to really be addressed for sure. But I totally agree that we still need to look at the person who is doing the harm. What's gone on? Again, what's gone on in their life? Why are they acting out like that? What is severely broken for them? What's been modelled to them in the past? All those sorts of things. And we were just been in Indonesia recently at an anti-trafficking conference, and we talked a little bit around a table the week after we went to one of the projects, and we were talking about that very thing in the culture there, when a man nearly is allowed to beat his wife. We need to ask that question, what is going on for that man? And as we explored that and asked those questions in this small group of people, they could see that for some of those men in that area, they're not allowed to talk about, number one, about their true feelings. They're certainly not allowed to cry. And there's lots and lots of trauma for a lot of those men. But then there's such shame for them if they come out and talk about what's really going on for them. And they've never really learned to understand their own frustrations and anger. So they don't really know how to manage it. There's so much brokenness at so many different levels. So yes, he should not be beating his wife. Absolutely. But let's also set up spaces where these men can learn to talk to each other and understand each other. So, Trish, absolutely. I think we need to be looking in those preventative spaces. And one of the most heartening things I've seen is in our Australian campaign for advertising about bringing up respect. I think is one of the most fantastic responses to looking at how can we reduce or end domestic violence. Well, how do we bring up our kids, particularly our boys? Brings back the, I guess, that parents, communities, schools, we all need to be involved in encouraging bringing up children who respect others because they've actually learned to respect themselves. So that's, I think, a really good area of a preventative action towards domestic violence.
Trish,
that actually has to work at the perpetrator side.
Trish, thank you so much for your insight today. 1800 316 316 to join in our conversation as we're talking about mercy, even extreme mercy here. Let's take another call ahead of the news. Lester is in Dalby in Queensland. Hi, Lester. Welcome.
Yes. Thank. Nice to talk to you. I think she's right about the fact that the perpetrators they have problems too, and I think they're acting out of their own confusion and need. They have urges that they can't control, and they don't know how to control them, and so they abuse other people because they don't know what to do with it.
Lester, you're making a good point here. I'll come to Matthew. Thoughts here for Lester, Matthew?
Yeah, I thoroughly agree there, Lester. It's a good point that people in those situations where they're hurting others are often confused and in need themselves. I want to make the point that in thinking about mercy in this way, we're not going soft on the wrongdoer. We certainly have to have mercy for those who are being hurt. That's first and foremost, to relieve the abuse that's done against the victims. But in doing that, we don't just let the bad guys, so-called, off the hook. It's not that they can just get away with anything. They need to be held to account. And so it's not as though justice would have us punish them, but mercy allows them to get off scot-free. That's not the biblical picture of how justice and mercy are positioned. More biblically, justice and mercy actually work together in harmony towards a greater goal of what in the Jewish language is shalom. And shalom is often just translated as peace, but it's a deeper concept than that. Shalom means where things are right, where things are whole and good and true. Relationships are right, relationships with each other, relationships with God, our self-understanding and identity, our relationship with the created world around us. In a state of shalom, things are whole and right. Everything being reconciled in Christ at the end of time is the perfect state of shalom. And so justice and mercy both tend towards or work towards shalom in conjunction with each other, not in opposition with each other.
Lester in Dalby in Queensland, thank you so much for another great contribution, Lester. 1-800-316-316. You might want to join into our conversation today as we're talking about a new book that's out, and it actually is shortlisted for this year's Australian Christian Book of the Year. It's called Disrupting Mercy, the Gift of Extreme Kindness Motivated by Compassion. Our two special guests, Matthew C. Clarke and Annabella Rossini-Clarke, they're the authors of this book, and as you can hear, we're into all sorts of new depths around understanding what mercy means. We're continuing after Vision National News. Talkback line open, 1-800-316-316. Wonderful to have you with us. It is the Friday edition of 2020, and if you are just joining us, you are joining a genuinely fascinating conversation about what it is to take things just that, well, let me just say, not just a little deeper, but we're a whole lot deeper into understanding what mercy means. Taking a deep dive into the meaning of mercy. What is mercy? What do we glean from the Bible about mercy? As Christians, we might identify that the whole world desperately needs mercy right now, so it might be refreshing to understand that mercy was central to the life, to the ministry, and to the message of Jesus. We're asking about biblical mercy. It's so radically disruptive and transformative. Our two special guests, Matthew C. Clarke and Annabella Rossini-Clarke, they've written a book called Disrupting Mercy, the Gift of Extreme Kindness Motivated by Compassion. And if you've been listening to our conversation up till now, you'll know that the mercy we're talking about is mercy towards the victim, but really, strangely and deeply, and perhaps new insight for some, mercy from the heart of God also extends to the perpetrator. So 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Before we take some more calls, and our talkback line open on 1-800-316-316, Matthew, let me come to you with an example that you talk about in your book. You call it an archetypal example of a man named Dirk Willems. Will you take up the story here, because we're in the deeper end talking about mercy, and this seems to me to be something that really switches the light on.
Yeah, Dirk Willems is a very inspiring man from the Anabaptist tradition around the time of the Reformation in the 16th century. During the Reformation, there was a group of people who thought that Luther and the other reformers weren't taking things far enough. And they, for instance, didn't believe in infant baptism, and they were pejoratively called the Anabaptists, or the re-baptizers. And Dirk Willems was one of these Anabaptists, and they were roundly persecuted by the reformers and the Catholics. And in 1569, he was in prison for his Anabaptist beliefs, and he managed to escape. But it was winter, and outside the jail there was a lake covered with ice, and he ran across the ice, and he was safely on the other side when one of the prison guards who'd seen that he was escaping chased him across the frozen lake and broke through the ice and fell in. So Dirk Willems safe on the other side, but he turns around and sees a man drowning in the icy water, and his mercy, the mercy that he had developed from following the habit of being like Christ, caused him to turn around, go back across the ice, pull the prison guard out to save him. And they both reached safe land, at which point the prison guard then arrested him and took him back to jail, and a couple of months later he was burned at the stake. So that, I think, is a paradigmatic example of mercy. It was an act of extreme kindness to someone who in no way deserved it, and yet was deeply in need. Willems saw his need, and his compassion for the man caused him to rescue the man, probably with the full knowledge that it would go badly for him.
It is an extreme example, isn't it? Because when you rescue the one who will capture you and take you back and you'll be burned at the stake, that is, it's hard to swallow, actually. For listeners, 1-800-316-316. Let's take some more calls. Jenny is in Maruya in New South Wales. Hi, Jenny. Welcome.
Thank you, Neil.
What are your thoughts, Jenny?
Well, my thought, I wanted to make a comment on Trish's subject. I'm so glad she brought it up. We do need to have compassion for the perpetrators in domestic violence. I was in a violent marriage for 17 years, so I was on the other side of that violence. But through all of that time, God taught me about mercy and understanding and forgiveness, and showed me the suffering that my husband was going through that brought him to be such a perpetrator. And I'm so grateful for that.
Wonderful thought, Jenny. And let's come to Bella on this. Your thoughts here for Jenny?
Oh, Jenny, yeah. Amazing. I mean, that takes it to the next stage, really, when you've actually chosen to stay. But what a wonderful depth of insight, as you say, that you develop. That's a gift that you have been given to understand a really complex situation. I'd love you on our team, Jenny, because there's something about understanding that, like, that is quite profound. And I know that not everyone could maybe endure that, but for those that can, I think this is what we're talking about, disrupting mercy. The idea of we disrupt this idea that it doesn't have to be transactional, is that you, like your husband, received a blessing that he may never know about, the fact that you could understand.
We're no longer married. It did end up in a divorce, but I have no bitterness whatsoever towards him. Yeah. Just mercy.
Yeah. I've got shivers going down my spine now, because that is really a situation where the idea of mercy has been completely disrupted. It's not about transaction. It's not about all those things. It's about understanding the other person and where they may have come from. And I'm glad you're safe, and I'm glad you've been able to get out.
Jenny, while we've got you on the phone here, just want to come to Matthew on this, because interesting, isn't it? What does the victim learn because oftentimes, I know listeners will say we talk about forgiveness, forgive much. You've been forgiven, you're to forgive. Well, there's a practical element that goes on from that forgiveness, and perhaps that is the display of mercy that comes from our own heart. Matthew, your thoughts here as you're just reflecting on what Jenny's sharing?
Yeah. Look, the first thing I'd like to say, if there's any listeners who are in a situation where they're being abused by their husband, the most important thing is to be safe.
Yeah.
And to do something to protect yourself. We should never be telling people, you've just got to understand and be kind and put up with it. That's not the message. To be merciful to the perpetrator requires them to be called to account, because there can be no real transformation unless they realise that what they've done is really damaging and hurtful and unnecessary. So mercy doesn't just let people off the hook. Make sure you're safe. Think about, I love your attitude, Jenny, that even though you're divorced now, you don't hold the things grudge against him. And that's a good position to be in, because then you're not weighed down by the burden of unforgiveness either. And he's also released, hopefully, to rethink and to change his life, having understood the consequences of what he's done.
Jenny in Moruya, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line open 1-800-316-316. Let's continue to take some calls. Nigel is in South Australia. Hi, Nigel.
Hi, mate.
What are your thoughts, Nigel?
I just have a question. I was reading about human trafficking and being arrested and used for body organs in China the other day. And this doctor rendered a testimony of how he was forced to assist these night patrols, and these doctors and the army guys would just bring in one of these dissidents in China and throw them in the van and remove his organs while he was alive. And he said the doctor saw who was holding him down, said the guy was definitely alive because his eyelids were moving and he was looking straight at him, and it took him many years to get over it. The question is, how would you deal with somebody that could do that barbaric and abominable thing to another human being? How would you minister to the family of that son or daughter or auntie that these guys have performed on them? How would you explain to them that you're going to show mercy that everybody is entitled to? But how would you minister to the family with that thing?
Let me come to Matthew here, because the imagery there, and apologies to some listeners, but this is reality, isn't it? These things do happen. Matthew, that's an extreme case here, and I imagine that there's going to be some sort of justice that is meted out by civil authorities here. But what are your thoughts for Nigel?
Yeah, horrendous situation. And the whole area of human trafficking is a broad range of really horrendous contexts, and organ trafficking is closely associated. They're not quite the same as human trafficking, but it's part of the problem. And it's almost unimaginable how someone can do that type of exploitation and abuse against another human being. We cry out with God for justice. And then the key question is, well, what does justice look like? How do we get to a point of justice? It's not just an eye for an eye. We can't just take the doctor's liver out and say, well, now it's equal. That doesn't resolve anything. There's some sense of justice restoring shalom. That takes a lot more hard work. So one part of mercy in that context would be, what could have happened 20 years before that changed the trajectory of both those people's lives to avoid the situation in the first place. But so I won't dwell on that too long, because the event has happened and something has to be done about this huge violation of human dignity. And it may well be that the perpetrator is put in jail. Jail is a place that's partly for punishment. It's partly to protect society so that the person can't continue doing what they're doing. But it's also a place for rehabilitation. And so part of the role of mercy would be to say, let's put the person in jail, and while they're there, during that time, let's do some work with that person to help them understand what they did, to help them regain some empathy for their victims, to help bring about some repentance, so that by the time they get out, they don't just go back and do the same thing again, but they are transformed by the confrontation with the consequences of what they're doing. That too is mercy.
Let me just throw something into the mix here. We've got Nigel on the line from South Australia, and he's given a really extreme example here. But, just recently on this program, we were talking about some issues that were developing in the Philippines, and a reflection back to Robert Duterte, who had a policy of having his police shoot drug dealers. Now, that's a dealing out of justice from a dictatorial position. Is there a sense here, and I'll come to you on this, Matthew, that the courts themselves, that there is justice, that the appearance of a court, and we can even give some, biblical foundation for the fact that we have courts and advocates, that actually is, the fact that there is a justice system is in itself a merciful thing, because otherwise you may have dictators just saying, we'll just take the law into our own hands and just shoot them dead. Any thoughts here around the value of a court?
Yeah, that's right. So the court is an important aspect of justice. It's not always, not all courts end up giving just decisions, because courts are about imposing a law, and laws aren't always just. There are unjust laws that sometimes we need to oppose, even as Christians. So courts have an important place to play. They bring order. And the reason for laws and for that aspect of justice is that the order will enable everyone to flourish, that it creates a context in which people are safe. And that's part of God's intention for the world, that the world should be a place where everybody has the opportunity to flourish. And there are cases where courts can't do that, and mercy more properly has an equal role when courts can't impose real justice. They can't restore shalom. And so mercy has an important role to play in conjunction with justice to do that restoration or that reconciliation. Paul says that we're ministers, we're ambassadors of reconciliation. So part of our task is to bring about the good, bring about right relationship, bring about reconciliation between people and God, to bring things back to how they were originally intended to be. And that involves partly the courts, some things that happen outside courts, and also some things that happen systemically, because just putting someone in jail doesn't solve the underlying system that caused the problem. Why did the person find themselves in the role of being an abuser, a human trafficker, a drug trafficker? What's the system that created the context for that? And we need to do some systemic change as well.
Nigel in South Australia, thank you so much for a good contribution. 1800 316 316 if you'd like to make another contribution to our conversation. But let's come back to the title of your book. It's called Disrupting Mercy, the gift of extreme kindness motivated by compassion. Just take us into this gift of extreme kindness here. And for listeners today who are thinking, what's in this that I would take away from a conversation about this? Because, a lot of people are not in the human trafficking space and dealing with perpetrators and victims. Thoughts here about how extreme kindness might affect each of us. Back to you again on this, Matthew, and then I'll come to Bella.
Yeah, so we might have made it sound as though the book's all about human trafficking, which it isn't. We just use human trafficking because that's the research I've been doing, and it shows an extreme case where anything we say about mercy can be put to the test. We don't want to just say mercy doesn't have any effect in the most tricky cases. So human trafficking is a good test case at the extreme end. I said that a simple definition of mercy would be compassion in action. And so in this book, we follow the line of thinking that mercy starts with compassion. We see someone in need and our hearts go out to them. And we have this compassionate response, wishing that we could do something to help them in their need. And it's not really dependent on whether they're a good person or a bad person. It's dependent on what their need is. So then once we've got compassion, then what do we do about it? It's not always clear how to express that compassion in a way that actually helps. We might do more harm than good if we're not careful by expressing our compassion naively. So our definition of mercy is that mercy is the gift of extreme kindness that's motivated by compassion. So it starts with compassion, but then it's a gift, and it's something about extreme kindness. So let me say something about those two things. Firstly, mercy in the biblical narrative is freely given without any concern about whether it was deserved and without any incurred debt. It's a gift that is given regardless of what people have done, because it's directed towards the need. It's a compassionate response to their need. It's not dependent on something people have done before. And also, mercy doesn't require a repayment later. If we say, well, I'll do this for you, but you must give me something back later, that's not mercy, that's a transaction. Mercy is freely given without any future debt. And then I've said mercy is extreme kindness. Mercy just isn't shaking someone's hand or giving them a couple of dollars. It's not being kind to the people that are our friends and family. It's something surprising. Mercy is something that you wouldn't expect. It goes beyond what could morally be expected. And so mercy is beyond kindness. It's something more extreme and surprising. And that leads us into an area of thinking about mercy as actually scandalous. The mercy in the New Testament is so wild, so uncontrolled, a free gift to people who don't deserve it, that nobody could expect. That's a scandalous idea.
A scandalous idea that we might throw ourselves on the mercy of God because we do not deserve His favour and His mercy and His salvation. Those sorts of things, sometimes we grapple with that spirituality, but there is also this flow-on effect, this practical side of how that mercy then is worked out in us. And I think this is where you are right in the middle of some wonderful insight. Let me ask you what your program is, because I think you're ready to hit the road and you'd like to actually visit with churches. You're based just on the north side of Sydney, and you'd like to connect with churches. This is a message that some churches will say, or some people who are part of various small groups or whatever opportunity there might be, they might love to have the two of you come and bring a presentation. You're open to those sorts of things? Is this something that you've got in a plan now from this time forward, Matthew?
I'm going to throw that one to Bella if I can.
Bella, let's go, Bella.
She has this idea of coffee and conversations.
That's the barista in me, you see. So we do actually have another little coffee cart that we can put on the back of our camper van, and we can go touring around. We can pull up at churches or in people's groups, schools, interest groups, whatever, and start fleshing this thing out a little bit more, because I think it's something that has to be talked about. We love talking about conversations around tables or over coffee, where you start to get to the nitty-gritty of this all sounds great out there, or human trafficking is the huge thing, but what does it look like in my relationship with my family or my church life or my friends? Because as I said right at the beginning, we've come full circle, that's a good practice ground for us to actually move towards the person who has caused us offence. And the first thing is choose not to be offended, and that enables you to go forward and go, I'm going to get to know them. Why are they acting like that? They're being really hurtful, and you can say stop, but I wonder why. And sometimes you need to push into that space and open it up for dialogue, and you can then really disrupt the situation and come to a better understanding. And that's where I think the transformation can happen. But we've got to learn to do it in the little places. And so we love having conversations. We love having meals with people. So please come to our website, put your hand up and say, we'd love to have you guys come and share with us at our youth group or at our church or whatever. And we would love to facilitate that kind of discussion.
The website is turningteardropsintojoy.com. turningteardropsintojoy.com. I'll give it in just a moment again too, but just to top off our conversation here, Matthew, for that listener who is saying, where do I start with all of this? Is there something that I can be even closing my eyes on my knees about? I know that there are victims and I know that there are perpetrators in my life, in my community, in the lives of my extended family. And is there something here that I can call upon a merciful God to intervene? How would I pray? What would be the thing that I would do before God to actually get the next step happening as I implement these merciful practices in my own life? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think our task as followers of Jesus is to pray that we would become more like Jesus. So to develop habits in our lives that reflect what we see in Jesus, because we know that what we see in Jesus reflects the character of God. So let's model ourselves on the life of Jesus and pray that we can become more understanding, more loving, more merciful, because we know our God is merciful. I think it's a matter of starting with ourselves, understanding our own need for mercy, and working around the people close to us so that we build a habit of showing mercy to people. So when a really horrendous thing happens, domestic violence, rape, the loss of someone important to us, we have already prepared our own character through habit to respond to that horrendous situation with the mercy of God as well.
Wonderful insights today, and a reminder to listeners that this conversation is going to be on a podcast a little later on this afternoon, and hopefully we'll get a web podcast onto YouTube with this conversation as well. It's such a valuable conversation, but let me give that website once again, turningteardropsintojoy.com. That's the way to connect with our two special guests today who have a coffee cart that they can put on as a trailer onto the back of their vehicle, and they are ready and willing and able to travel. And if you at all are thinking maybe they could be a guest at our church, at our youth groups, this may be something very special. Our two guests, Matthew C. Clarke and Annabella Rossini-Clarke. Their book is called Disrupting Mercy, The Gift of Extreme Kindness, Motivated by Compassion. It is one of those books shortlisted for this year's Australian Christian Book of the Year. But to Matthew and to Bella, thank you so much for taking some time to share your heart with us today on 2020. Matthew, thank you.
Thank you, Neil. That's been wonderful. Thank you.
And Bella, thank you.